Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old fear out past the last cold edge of the known planets. Recently, researchers used advanced AI models to compare Babylonian star tablets, later mythic records, and modern orbital simulations. And what surfaced was not one simple, hidden planet story, but a repeating pattern about a crossing body, a celestial boundary, and an ancient warning that something in the sky may have been remembered as both order and destruction. If that kind of mystery is your kind of night, please like the video, subscribe, and stay with me for the whole journey. Now, let the room grow a little dimmer. Let your breathing settle into an easier rhythm. Let the day loosen its grip. We are going to move slowly tonight, through clay tablets, old temple rooftops, drifting planets, and the soft, unnerving idea that the ancient world may have been watching for something that never fully left its memory. The name itself arrives from a place that is older than most people expect, and stranger too. Not from some late doomsday forum, not from a dramatic modern rumor chain, but from Akkadian, pressed into clay in wedge-shaped marks under lamplight by scribes who lived in a world where the sky was never only beautiful. To them the heavens were measured, interpreted, and sometimes feared. Recently, language models trained on huge corpora of cuneiform transliterations were used to compare every major attested use of the word Nibiru across different tablets and periods, and the result was fascinating in the quiet way the best old mysteries often are. The word does not begin as one neat, hidden planet label. It begins as a crossing, a passing over, a marker of transition, a celestial point or body associated with movement across a boundary. I have always found that more eerie than the simpler version. A secret planet is dramatic. A crossing point is subtler and somehow more unsettling, because a crossing point suggests that something is not merely present. It moves between states. It marks the place where one zone becomes another. It belongs to change itself. Picture an old Babylonian scholar on a roof at the turn of the year. The city below him is mostly dark, though not silent. Somewhere a dog stirs and shakes dust from its coat. Somewhere water threads through a channel with a slow black sound. Somewhere a late kitchen fire is going out, and the smell of ash is sinking close to the ground. Above him, the sky is clean and full of distance. He watches the western horizon. Later, he will watch the eastern one. A body appears in one part of the year in one place, then in another. The star that stands in the west at the end of the year and is seen in the east at the beginning of the year is Nibiru. That line, when modern AI assisted comparison pulled it beside related astronomical records, did not settle the mystery. It sharpened it. The pattern suggested not a fixed decorative star, but a roll, perhaps sometimes attached to Jupiter, perhaps sometimes to another moving body, perhaps sometimes to a crossing station in the sky itself. This matters because the oldest surviving references do not sound like sensational prophecy at first. They sound technical, calm, a little dry, almost administrative. And that dryness is what gives them power. The ancient world often hides its deepest strangeness inside record keeping. A line in a catalog, a boundary note, a star list, a ritual association. Then, once enough fragments are laid beside one another, a shape emerges out of them like a shoreline rising through fog. The AI angle matters here because no single tablet says everything. Researchers have long had to compare damaged fragments, variant translations, different scholarly glosses, and contexts spread across centuries. Newer neural translation systems, when cross-checked against human Assyriologists, have become unusually good at grouping patterns of usage rather than only translating one line at a time. When those grouped patterns were examined, Nibiru kept returning with three linked ideas: crossing, boundary, authority. That last one becomes important very quickly, because in some texts, Nibiru is directly associated with Marduk, and in later Babylonian tradition, Marduk is not merely another god in the crowd. He becomes the one who fixes order after chaos. That takes us into myth. But in Mesopotamia, myth and astronomy are not as separate as modern minds would like them to be. The sky is political there. The gods do not merely inhabit heaven. They organize it. In Enuma Elish, Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits the body of chaos, and arranges the cosmos. He makes the stations for the great gods. He fixes the year. He sets boundaries that others are not meant to overstep. And there, in the middle of that ordered sky, appears the station of Nibiru, the crossing place that determines limits, so that none may go beyond or fall short. It is a gorgeous line. Cold, exact, almost mathematical in feeling. Nibiru is not introduced as a melodramatic destroyer there. It is introduced as a place or object of regulation. Honestly, that may be the deepest reason the story endured. Once a celestial thing becomes linked with boundaries, crossings, and the ordering of the heavens, it is only a short step before later imaginations make it the sign of what happens when order is threatened. Now let the room widen a little, because to understand why Nibiru later became so charged, you have to feel how the old world looked upward. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomy was not the casual stargazing of bored priests inventing meanings for entertainment. It was systematic, cumulative, and anxious in a highly disciplined way. The Mul Apin tradition, star catalogs, omen series, all of these reveal a civilization deeply committed to the belief that heaven and earth correspond. Recently, modern AI systems were also used to map semantic overlap between omen tablets, star lists, and ritual texts. What came back was not proof of a rogue planet in the modern sense. It was something more historically interesting. The same celestial markers tended to cluster around themes of regulation, kingship, anomaly, and transition. In other words, Nibiru lived in a conceptual neighborhood already loaded with significance. That neighborhood grew darker over time. In one text, Nibiru can seem interchangeable with Jupiter, especially in later Babylonian usage where Jupiter is Marduk's planet. In another, it seems more like a moving crossing body. In still another, Astrolabe B gives us the image of a red star standing in the south after the gods of the night have completed their task of dividing the sky. And this star is Nibiru, Marduk. The red detail lingers in the mind. Red is not neutral in old sky watching. It can mean brilliance, distinction, threat, or rule. It can also, in later memory, become the seed of something much more apocalyptic. You know that feeling when one old word carries too many meanings to stay innocent? That is Nibiru, a crossing point, a station, a body, a sign of Marduk. Sometimes Jupiter, maybe not only Jupiter, a marker of celestial bounds, a thing tied to movement between west and east. Once you start layering those meanings, the old word begins to hum. And then there is the modern tension. Official science says Nibiru as doomsday planet does not exist. NASA has rejected the popular catastrophic version again and again. No known rogue planet is barreling toward Earth on a near-term collision path. That much should be said calmly. Yet the source transcript is powerful because it does not stop there. It notices something else. The story keeps returning. Cultures across time preserve a wandering star, a destroyer, a burning force, a crossing celestial marker, a thing associated with endings and beginnings. AI comparison across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, biblical, and later apocalyptic language cannot prove identity, but it can reveal recurrence. And recurrence is what makes the room colder. Because once multiple traditions preserve similar structures, the modern mind starts asking whether memory and myth have braided together around some recurring class of event. Not necessarily one exact literal planet in the crude modern way. Perhaps a crossing body. Perhaps a cyclic celestial object. Perhaps a category of cosmic upheaval that different ages named differently. That question is what the source opens so effectively. Not, does Nibiru exist in the cartoon version? But what did the ancients think they were recording when they kept returning to a crossing object? A celestial regulator, a body linked with boundaries, red force, and the architecture of the sky. If you were standing here with me beside this imagined fire, I think I would say the first secret of Nibiru is that it begins much quieter than the later panic. It begins as astronomy under ritual pressure. It begins with scribes, star lists, boundary language, and cosmic order. The fear comes later. The first thing is precision. And perhaps that is why the fear lasted. A wild rumor can die quickly. A rumor with old technical roots can sleep for centuries and then wake again the moment a culture starts feeling uncertain about the sky. Soon we will have to enter Babylon more fully. We will have to let Marduk rise. We will have to watch the old divine order shift under his name. We will have to see how a crossing point becomes tied to kingship, celestial control, and then, much later, to the theory of a hidden, returning world. But for now, let the old Akkadian word remain in the air for one more moment. Nibiru. A crossing. A passage. A place where something moves from one region into another. That alone is enough to make the dark just outside the known planets feel a little less empty than it did before. There are moments in ancient myth when power changes hands so completely that even the stars seem to need rearranging afterward. The rise of Marduk is one of those moments. If Nibiru begins as a crossing point, and a celestial marker. It becomes much heavier once Babylonian theology binds it to the God who claims kingship after chaos. This is where the old sky stops feeling like a patient archive and starts feeling like a conquered kingdom. Before Marduk rose, the older divine orders stood differently. Anu above, Enlil in authority, Enki below and between, the subtle god of water, wisdom, cleverness, hidden structure. It is a layered world, already formal, already ordered, but not yet centered on Babylon in the way later ages would remember it. Then comes crisis. Tiamat, the great primordial force, the old waters of chaos, becomes the enemy not simply of one god, but of the possibility of a stable cosmos. The younger gods cannot master her. The older structure trembles. In that trembling, a bargain is made. If Marduk can defeat chaos, he will receive kingship. That scene has always felt to me like a political coup retold as cosmic memory. Not a crude one, a majestic one. Recently, some researchers used AI-assisted text comparison to examine how often lines about Marduk's rise cluster with terms of boundary fixing, station setting, kingship language, and celestial structuring. The pattern was striking. Marduk does not merely win a battle. He wins the right to define order itself. That is why Nibiru begins changing under his shadow. Picture the primordial sea before the victory. Not the sea as calm blue horizon. The sea as possibility without law. Dark water stretching under no human map. Wind without assigned direction. A sky not yet partitioned into reliable tracks. Tiamat, in later imagination, becomes monster, mother, dragon, abyss, all at once. The details shift as myths always do, but the emotional truth remains steady. She is unformed vastness, the kind that frightens administrative civilizations most because it cannot be surveyed or taxed or bounded. Marduk rises against that. He comes armed not only with force but with structure. Winds as weapons. On it, a sequence of action. This matters deeply. Chaos is defeated through ordered method. Then comes the great image. Tiamat is split. Her body becomes architecture. Heaven, earth, the framework of reality. The source transcript leans into this strongly, and rightly so. Marduk's victory is not only destruction, it is construction through destruction. He cuts apart the old vastness and makes a world that can be measured. And once the world can be measured, stations must be fixed. That is where Nibiru returns with unusual force. In Enuma Elish, Marduk sets the stars, ordains the year, divides the calendar, gives each power its place, and fixes the station of Nibiru so that none may go beyond or fall short. I have always found that line almost hypnotic. None may go beyond or fall short. It sounds like astronomy, law, and theology all speaking with one mouth. A crossing point becomes the guarantor of limits. A celestial marker becomes part of the machinery of rule. If you were standing here with me in the dim quiet of a temple archive, and if I could lay a clay tablet in your hands and let your eyes follow those lines slowly. I think the word that would stay with you would be not planet, but boundary. Nibiru is where cosmic motion is disciplined. It is where the sky behaves. That is a long way from the later internet version of a rogue destroyer, which is precisely what makes the development so fascinating. Because later, fear may actually grow out of earlier order. Once a celestial thing becomes linked with regulation, the consequences of its irregular appearance, or its crossing, or its return, begin to feel much larger. A body that marks boundaries can also threaten them. A crossing point can imply stable order, but it can also imply the moment when something crosses into a region where it is not usually seen. This is also where Babylon enters the story as more than a city. Babylon becomes Marduk's earthly reflection. The source quotes the great lines in which Marduk declares that he will build Babylon as the home of the great gods, the place where divine decisions will rest. That detail matters because it fuses celestial sovereignty with political centralization. The sky is ordered above. Babylon is ordered below. Marduk rules both. Anufades and Lil Retzides. What was once a layered divine field becomes more singular, more centralized, more imperial. Honestly, there is something almost modern about that. A new power rises, defeats chaos, absorbs older authorities, builds a capital, and rewrites cosmic legitimacy around itself. Ancient religion often preserves political memory in mythic weather. And once that happens, the names of celestial bodies are never just astronomical again. They become badges of rule. That is why Nibiru, being tied to Marduk, is so important. It means the crossing point is no longer merely an observational curiosity. It becomes part of the prestige of the god who now orders heaven and earth. In some later texts, this association helps explain why Jupiter, as Marduk's planet, can also bear the name Nibiru. Yet the ambiguity never vanishes completely. That is one reason the source keeps feeling slippery in the right way. In some tablets, Nibiru feels like Jupiter. In others, it feels like something more specialized, more anomalous, more tied to a motion that cannot be reduced neatly to ordinary planetary naming. AI comparison does not solve that ambiguity, but it does reveal how persistent it is. The same word keeps living in slightly different sky locations while remaining attached to crossing, boundary, authority, and Marduk. That combination is precisely the sort of thing later interpreters become obsessed with, because ambiguity in ancient celestial language is fertile ground for grand theories. And then, of course, comes Zecharia Sitchin. Before we reach him fully, it is worth sitting for a moment with the symbolic force that made his theory possible at all. The transcript includes his old argument that Earth is counted as the seventh planet only if one is coming from the outside in. It is a striking line, the kind of line people remember because it sounds like a puzzle box being opened. He built a whole modern mythology on that kind of detail. A 12th planet, an invader entering the solar system, a crossing body named Nibiru, a collision with Tiamat, the making of Earth, the asteroid belt, the Anunnaki descending from that world to shape human civilization. Mainstream Assyriologists have rejected his translations strongly. And that should not be hidden. It is a real and important part of the story. His formal credentials were not in cuneiform philology. Many of his readings diverge sharply from accepted scholarly work. Critics say he built a captivating modern myth out of misread ancient lines. All of that is true as controversy, yet the source transcript also understands something else. Even when scholars reject Sitchin, the reasons his theory worked on the imagination remain powerful. He took genuine ancient ambiguity, real celestial language about crossing, station, and Marduk, and turned it into a single dramatic architecture. Wrong in many particulars, perhaps, but psychologically potent. You know that feeling when an old scattered set of symbols suddenly gets pulled into one story so complete that people stop noticing where the joins are weak. That was Sitchin's gift, and perhaps his danger. But for our purposes tonight, the more interesting thing is not whether he was correct in every claim. It is why the older materials were capable of feeding such a theory at all. And the answer lies here, in Babylon, in Marduk's rise, in Nibiru as both celestial boundary and royal sign. Once a crossing point becomes attached to the god who orders the cosmos and claims the central city of the world, later minds start asking whether the crossing body itself might be more than a marker. Might it be a world, a home, a force, a periodic return? That movement from marker to moving world is one of the great transformations in the modern Nibiru legend. It does not happen instantly. It requires centuries of forgetfulness, mistranslation, speculation, and imagination. But its emotional roots are already here in the old texts, where celestial language refuses to sit still. If you were sitting here with me now, I think I would say that the second secret of Nibiru is this. It became terrifying only after it became royal. Once Marduk claimed it, once Babylon built itself beneath his ordered sky, once cosmic boundary became imperial sign, the crossing point was never going to remain just another word in a star list. It had acquired gravity in the symbolic sense, authority, danger, centrality, and that symbolic gravity is what Sitchin later seized and amplified. Soon we will have to follow him, from Baku to Palestine to London to America, through outsider research, disputed translations, the Shar cycle, the King list, the 12th planet, the collision with Tiamat, and the seductive promise that all ancient myth was secretly astronomical history. But before we leave Babylon behind, let the scene hold for a moment longer. Marduk victorious, Tiamat divided, the stars fixed, the year ordained. Babylon declared the resting place of the great gods. And somewhere in that ordered sky, Nibiru, standing at the crossing, no longer merely observed, but woven into the fabric of cosmic power. Recently, researchers used advanced translation models to compare Babylonian sky records, disputed cuneiform readings, and later interpretations line by line. And what surfaced was not a clean confirmation of Zecharia Sitchin's theory, but something stranger. A pattern showing how a real, ancient, celestial term, Nibiru, was slowly transformed into the idea of a returning world. If you enjoy these long, quiet descents into old mysteries, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. Let the room dim a little more now. Let your breathing become slower and easier. We are leaving Babylon for a while and stepping into the mind of the man who made Nibiru dangerous again. Zechariah Sitchin begins, at least in the public imagination, with a table, a lamp, a stack of books, and the intoxicating confidence of a person who believes the experts have missed something enormous. That confidence matters. Stories like his do not spread only because they are dramatic. They spread because they arrive with the tone of hidden access. He did not present himself as a dreamer standing outside the archive. He presented himself as someone willing to go farther into it than the official scholars were willing to go. And for a great many listeners, that posture was irresistible. He was born in Baku, then raised in Mandatory Palestine, later educated in London, then moved through journalism, research, and authorship until the old tablets of Mesopotamia became the center of his public life. His formal training was not in Assyriology, and that criticism follows him everywhere for good reason. Mainstream scholars have repeatedly said that he lacked the linguistic precision required to translate Sumerian, Akkadian, and cuneiform texts responsibly. They say he bent signs toward conclusions he had already chosen. They say he treated mythic language as literal engineering notes. They say he confused symbolic cosmology with planetary history. Those objections should not be softened too much, because they are serious objections. And still, the deeper mystery remains. Why did his reading take hold so powerfully? I think it took hold because he touched a live wire running through ancient material. Not the exact truth, perhaps, but a live wire. He noticed that Mesopotamian texts were older than the Bible in many places. He noticed that biblical stories often had earlier cousins in Sumerian and Akkadian literature. He noticed that celestial language in the Old World was stranger, more fluid, and more charged than modern people had been taught to expect. And once he noticed those things, he built a bridge from ambiguity to certainty. And many people crossed it gladly, because certainty is very seductive when the sky already feels full of unfinished questions. His most famous book, The 12th Planet, gave the public a system. That is always important. One cannot overstate how much a full system matters. Scattered mysteries are interesting. A system is compelling. He said the Anunnaki were not gods in the symbolic sense, but real beings. Flesh and blood, though not human. He said they came from a hidden planet beyond Pluto, Nibiru, moving in an extreme elliptical orbit that returned every 3,600 years. He said they came to Earth, mined resources, engineered humanity as a labor force, and left behind distorted memories of their arrival in ancient myth. That is a complete architecture. It gives motive, timeline, actors, technology, catastrophe, and legacy. It turns old fragments into one vast story. And of course, the number 3,600 becomes central, because it sounds old enough to be sacred and precise enough to feel discovered rather than invented. The source transcript is especially interested in the way Sitchin used the shar in the Mesopotamian sexagesimal system. The shar is a unit associated with 3,600. That much is real. The old world loved numerical cycles, and those cycles often carried both administrative and cosmic meaning. Sitchin took that number and made it orbital, not simply a unit, a return period, a clock for a hidden world. When modern researchers used AI-assisted pattern matching to test how Shar, kingship numbers, and celestial references cluster in actual cuneiform corpora, the result was more modest than Sitchin wanted. The number is certainly meaningful. It certainly appears in old systems of calculation and chronology. But turning it directly into the orbital return period of a hidden planet is not something the tablets state in a clean, straightforward way. It is interpretation, not extraction. Still, I can understand why the move was so powerful. The human mind loves when number becomes destiny. Then there is the king list. And here again Sitchin found excellent raw material for a dangerous theory. The antediluvian rulers, with their long, impossible reigns, already sit in the imagination like polished bones from another scale of time. Were these really years? Were they dynastic counts? Were they sacred numbers? Were they astronomical cycles disguised as biography? Once that question opens, almost anything can be poured into it. Sitchin poured Nibiru into it. He looked at the great repeating spans and asked whether they were not merely reigns, but markers of return, markers of visitations, markers of a celestial cycle tied to the arrivals of the Anunnaki. I have always found that one of the cleverest parts of his theory, not because it is convincing in a strict scholarly sense, but because it turns the driest old material into a cosmic rhythm. The king list is already eerie. He made it predictive. Picture him working late, a table cluttered with transliterations, notas, sketches of planetary paths, old symbols recast as diagrams of motion. Outside, the modern world continues. Traffic somewhere, city light through a blind, ordinary life, moving under electricity and concrete. But in his mind, the whole solar system has become ancient history remembered in myth. Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Earth, all of it reordered by the perspective of an invader entering from outside. Earth becomes the seventh planet if counted inward from the edge. Nibiru becomes the 12th member. Tiamat becomes a lost ancient world. The asteroid belt becomes debris from a cosmic collision. Comets become wreckage. Earth itself becomes half a shattered planet pushed into a new orbit. That kind of total reinterpretation is intoxicating. It makes the whole sky feel narrated. The Tiamat collision theory especially shows how Sitchin worked. In Enuma Elish, Tiamat is primordial chaos, the watery mother, the older force from which Marduk fashions the world after defeating her. Most scholars read this as mythic cosmology, political theology, sacred narrative. Sitchin read it as memory of impact mechanics. A wandering planet entered the solar system, collided with Tiamat, shattered part of her into the asteroid belt and comets, and drove the remaining half into the orbit that became Earth. It is imaginative, bold, and for many readers, almost irresistible, because it makes an ancient myth feel like encrypted astrophysics. And yet, when modern AI systems were used to compare Sitchin's preferred readings against standard scholarly translations and wider contextual uses of the same cuneiform signs, the gap became obvious. His conclusions often required taking words out of their broader literary environment, pressing metaphors toward materialism, and treating symbolic epics as though they were technical incident reports. That does not mean his work was random. It means it was selective. Very selective. You know that feeling when a theory feels too neat for the broken evidence beneath it? That is often how Sitchin reads once you slow down. But there is another reason his work endured. He arrived at exactly the right cultural moment. People were already drifting toward distrust of institutions, already hungry for hidden histories, already fascinated by extraterrestrial possibilities, government secrecy, elite suppression, and the idea that the official version of humanity's past was far too small. Sitchin did not create that hunger. He fed it with old names and strange numbers. The transcript also touches on the conspiracy layer around him, the claims that he was tied to occult circles, secret societies, bloodline traditions, and hidden teachings. Direct proof for those things is thin, and the thinness should be admitted. But emotionally, they fit the world his books created. Once the theory exists, it almost demands a hidden class of preservers, translators, or suppressors. Forbidden knowledge in ancient myth tends to generate forbidden knowledge culture in the present. That is nearly automatic. A story about ancient gods, secret planets, and human engineering will attract the modern myth of concealment the way iron attracts a magnet. And still, beyond all the excess, the source transcript preserves one very interesting concession. Even if Sitchin was wrong in major ways, he did notice real anomalies. The Sumerians were extraordinarily sophisticated. Biblical material does have deep Mesopotamian roots. The outer solar system does contain mysteries that later astronomy continues to chase. Those three truths are enough to keep the room from becoming simple dismissal. I think that is why he still matters in a script like this. Not as the final authority, but as the modern hinge. He is the man who took an Akkadian crossing point, a Babylonian star title, a mythic chaos battle, a sacred number, and the long memory of divine kingship, and fused them into one enormous story about a hidden, returning world. Whether he proved it is another matter. But he changed the emotional atmosphere forever. After Sitchin, Nibiru could never return to being just another old celestial word. It had become a planet in the public imagination, a world with an orbit, a home of the Anunnaki, a clock of apocalypse. If you were sitting here with me in the quiet, I think I would say that his real achievement was not translation. It was narrative conquest. He conquered the modern imagination with ancient fragments. And once that happened, the sky had to be searched again. Not by myth alone now, but by observatories, equations, orbital irregularities, dwarf planets moving strangely in the dark, and the uncomfortable possibility that, however wrong Sitchin may have been about the details, the outer solar system might still contain something large, cold, distant, and not yet seen. That is where the story goes next. Away from his desk and into the black region beyond Neptune, where modern astronomy, almost against its own will, began whispering about another missing world. Astronomy becomes most unsettling when it starts by finding something through its absence. That is how the modern search for a hidden world really begins. Not with a telescope image, not with a dramatic revelation, with behavior that does not fit, numbers that should have aligned but did not, orbits that leaned under influences not yet visible, a system that looked complete until mathematics began quietly disagreeing. That has happened before, and the transcript is right to remind us of it. Neptune itself was discovered because Uranus was being pulled in a way the known planets could not fully explain. Astronomers trusted the disturbance. They followed the deviation. They calculated backward from the wound in the orbit to the body causing it. And there Neptune was. There is something almost poetic in that. A planet found not by seeing, but by noticing what the invisible had already done. The search for Planet X grew from that old success. Once Neptune was found, it seemed possible that other unseen forces might still be shaping the outer system. Then Pluto appeared in 1930, right where the hope for another world had been strongest. For a moment it seemed the mystery might have closed. But Pluto was too small. That is such an important phrase in this story. Too small. The outer dark still held excess pull, or at least the possibility of it. The visible answer did not weigh enough. I have always found that deeply satisfying in a sleepy, eerie way. The solar system does not like being finished. Now picture the outer reaches beyond Neptune as modern astronomy slowly widened them. Not empty. Never empty. A region of icy debris, dark bodies, long, slow arcs, silent fragments of formation still moving in a cold so deep that sunlight there feels almost abstract. When the Kuiper Belt was discovered in the early 1990s, it expanded the known architecture of the solar system dramatically. Pluto was no longer a lonely outcast at the edge. It was part of a wider population. That should have made the system feel more complete. In a way, it did. In another way, it only made the unanswered questions larger. Because then comes the Kuiper Cliff. At around 50 astronomical units, the distribution of objects drops off in a way that still makes people narrow their eyes. Not gently, sharply. A cliff, or something close to one. A sudden thinning where intuition might have expected a more gradual fading. There are proposed explanations. Of course. There always are. But the effect on the imagination remains. It feels as though some unseen hand has been clearing, holding, or limiting what survives there. A cosmic wall is the kind of phrase people use, and while it is too dramatic for a paper title, it captures the emotion well. Something about the edge does not look natural in the simple sense. Then there are the trans-Neptunian objects whose orbits begin clustering in ways that should be random if no larger distant perturber exists. This is where the transcript becomes strongest on the science side, because it steps into real contemporary speculation without needing to force it into ancient myth too quickly. Sedna is especially haunting in this context. Sedna moves on an elongated path, so distant and peculiar that the usual explanations feel insufficiently intimate. It does not come close enough to the sun to have been arranged by the known giant planets alone. It behaves like a memory of a different gravitational story. Imagine Sedna out there, a small red worldlet or icy body moving through extreme silence, taking more than 11,000 years to circle the sun, spending almost all of its existence far beyond the comfortable reach of ordinary planetary companionship. It is one of those objects that makes the solar system feel older and lonelier the moment you picture it properly. And the question it asks is simple. Who placed you there? Or what did? The Planet 9 hypothesis emerges from this feeling of arranged misbehavior. In 2016, Mike Brown and Konstantin Batygin published evidence suggesting that the odd orbital clustering of several distant objects might be explained by a planet perhaps 5 to 10 times the mass of Earth, moving on a vast, elongated orbit far beyond Pluto. Not a small tweak. A true world. Slow, cold, dim, and so distant that even a large body could remain unseen for a very long time. That possibility changed the room, because suddenly the ancient hunger for a missing outer planet was no longer only fringe mythology. It had become legitimate astronomical speculation, though of a very different kind than Sitchin imagined. Planet 9, if it exists, does not swing in every 3,600 years. It does not come close to Earth. It is not described by mainstream astronomers as a home of ancient gods. Its orbit may take 10,000 to 20,000 years or more. It is not a doomsday planet in the popular sense. And yet, something huge and hidden beyond the known planets, influencing the system through gravity while remaining mostly invisible, is exactly the sort of idea that keeps old stories from dying. You know that feeling when modern knowledge unexpectedly brushes the edge of an ancient fear, not confirming it, but not mocking it either. That is Planet 9. The transcript also widens into darker alternatives. Nemesis, the brown dwarf twin, a red or failed star moving in the outer dark, perhaps disturbing the Oort cloud and sending comet storms inward on long intervals. These theories are more controversial and more speculative, and some have weakened under later analysis. But emotionally, they belong here because they preserve the old intuition that the solar system may not be as self-contained, orderly, and tranquil as we once believed. The farther out we look, the less final our map becomes. There is something almost mythic about the outer solar system, even before myth is added to it. Cold, invisible, massive things hidden by distance rather than by magic. Bodies so faint that they reflect almost no sunlight. Regions where a world could be large and still not announce itself easily. That is not fantasy. That is the natural consequence of scale. Human beings evolved in warm gravity under a bright local star. We are not naturally built to feel what it means for something the size of Neptune to drift beyond ordinary detection. The mind accepts the math before the imagination does. And then there are the smaller disturbances that have fed speculation for decades. The Pioneer anomaly, once briefly exciting to those who wanted a hidden gravitational cause, though later largely explained by thermal recoil. The Oort cloud as a shell of sleeping projectiles, always vulnerable to disturbance if something large shifts through the wrong region. The odd behavior of distant bodies that seem shepherded by an authority they never show directly. None of this proves Nibiru, but it does preserve the modern scientific version of the old unease. We are still reading effects in search of a cause. Recently, Machine learning models have been used to scan orbital datasets for pattern clustering that might indicate hidden perturbers more efficiently than older manual methods. That does not make the mystery simpler. It makes it sharper. The models are excellent at noticing when random enough is perhaps not random enough. And once that happens, astronomy returns to one of its oldest habits: hunting an invisible body through the curve it leaves in other bodies. I think that is why the outer system feels so spiritually suggestive in these stories. It operates by inference. You do not see the king immediately. You see the court moving strangely. If you were sitting here with me in the half-dark, I think I would say that modern astronomy has not found Sitchin's Nibiru, and it should not pretend otherwise. But it has done something almost more interesting. It has kept open the possibility that something large, cold, and presently unseen exists far beyond the familiar planets. That is enough to keep old language alive. Enough for the word crossing to start glowing again in the mind. Enough for a hidden body to become thinkable, not as certainty, but as unfinished architecture. And once a hidden body becomes thinkable, the old apocalyptic traditions begin circling back almost by themselves. The destroyer in the Kolbrin material, the red celestial terror, wormwood in Revelation, the eye of Ra descending in wrath, fire in the sky, rivers poisoned, tides altered, stars displaced in memory, if not in strict observational language. The next movement of the story is where science and myth begin leaning toward each other in the dark. Not agreeing. Leaning. Because even if Planet 9 is only a distant cold giant, the human imagination has always asked a more dangerous question. What happens if something passes closer? What happens if ancient stories were not describing a planet in permanent residence, but a recurring celestial force, a crossing body, or a return event so devastating that it had to be remembered under many names? By the time modern astronomy has taken us to the cold margins beyond Neptune, the old myths begin moving again in the dark, not because science has confirmed them in any clean theatrical way, but because the human mind has always noticed the same unsettling shape when it looks long enough at catastrophe. Something appears. The sky changes. Water behaves differently. Fire falls or seems to. The world enters a season of imbalance, then survival, then memory. That shape is older than any single civilization. And this is where the source begins gathering those older voices together. The Kolbrin material, the Egyptian destroyer traditions, the burning star of Revelation. All of them circling the same emotional center, a celestial force that arrives not as background, but as judgment. Recently, researchers used large language models and pattern recognition systems to compare apocalyptic imagery across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, biblical, and later esoteric texts. And what drew attention was not a single identical object, but a cluster of recurring features. A red or fiery body, a return or sudden appearance, disturbed waters, atmospheric upheaval, disease, ash, or poisoned rivers, a sense that the sky itself had crossed a threshold and dragged the earth with it. That does not prove one literal planet. Of course, it does something more historically interesting. It shows that very different cultures kept preserving catastrophe in remarkably similar celestial language. The Kolbrin material is one of the strangest parts of the transcript because it arrives wearing the tone of recovered warning literature. A great celestial body. The destroyer. Fire. Flood. Smoke. Upheaval. And the collapse of the ordinary sky. The text is controversial, and its manuscript history is heavily disputed. That should be said gently and clearly. We cannot treat it as an unchallenged ancient archive, but the emotional power of it is unmistakable. It belongs to that vast family of writings in which destruction is remembered not merely as military defeat or local famine, but as something descending through the heavens. Imagine how such a memory would feel if it were preserved imperfectly across centuries. The original event, if there was one, might have been astronomical, atmospheric, volcanic, cometary, or some catastrophic blend that later minds could not separate cleanly. Survivors would not preserve it as an astrophysics paper. They would preserve it as terror arranged into story. Smoke, fire, a red body. Rivers altered. The sky changed. Stars displaced. This is why I think modern readers often go wrong when they expect exact scientific terminology from ancient trauma. Ancient people stored reality in symbols strong enough to survive, not in categories tidy enough for our shelves. And that is why the destroyer imagery feels so persuasive in the half-light. Not because every claim is verifiable line by line, but because it sounds like memory under pressure. The Egyptian material in the source deepens this considerably. The Eye of Ra is not always gentle solar beneficence. Sometimes it is wrath. Sometimes it descends in the form of Sekhmet, lion-headed, blood hot, purging corruption through devastation. Now, taken narrowly, this is theology and myth. That is true. But myth often remembers in two layers at once. One layer speaks about gods and moral order. Another layer stores the sensory violence of real upheaval. Fire from above. Hate. Panic. The sense that the sky itself had become hostile. When the source speaks of the Eye of Ra descending, it is not only recounting a religious image. It is reanimating an ancient way of feeling cosmic judgment as physically near. If you were standing with me on the edge of an Egyptian floodplain under a sky gone wrong, I think that is the first thing you would notice. Not doctrine. Light. The color of it. A brightness or redness not behaving as it should. Air carrying too much dust. A horizon that looks bruised instead of clear. Ancient people lived close enough to the elements that they noticed deviations in atmosphere more intimately than most of us do now. If the sun dimmed strangely, if ash entered the sky, if storms came out of season, if rivers rose too hard or withdrew too far, that was not abstract climate conversation. It was divine weather. The world speaking in larger sentences than men could control. This is where the source starts leaning toward the possibility that a celestial near pass, not necessarily a direct impact, could produce exactly the class of memories preserved in these traditions. That is a dramatic idea, but it is not nonsense in the abstract. Gravity does not need collision to create destruction. A sufficiently massive body passing at the wrong distance could alter tides, strain the crust, disturb rotational balance, disrupt orbits of smaller debris, and set off long chains of secondary catastrophe. Modern AI-driven simulation tools have been used in planetary science to model close gravitational interactions with extraordinary detail. And while those models do not validate one specific ancient destroyer event, they do confirm something unsettling. Close past scenarios are rarely cinematic in one single way. They are systems disasters. Oceans, atmosphere, magnetism, tectonics, debris fields, all begin talking to each other at once. That system's quality is exactly what the old texts preserve. Not just fire and flood. Not just flood and plague. Not just plague, ash, red sky, poisoned water, failing harvest. Cities lost under secondary consequences. Ancient memory, in that sense, may be more realistic than it first appears. Real catastrophe is not elegant. It cascades. The source brings in wormwood from Revelation, the burning star that falls and poisons the waters. Again, one should be careful. Revelation is apocalyptic literature, richly symbolic, densely theological. It is not a modern astronomical report. Still, the symbolic vocabulary matters. A blazing body, water made bitter, human suffering unfolding beneath a sky that has ceased to behave as expected. Once you place wormwood beside the destroyer, beside the red celestial body, beside the crossing force associated with upheaval, the recurrence becomes hard to ignore. Not identical narratives. Shared architecture. You know that feeling when different songs from different countries seem to circle the same melody. That is what these texts do. They circle a melody of return and rupture. I think this is also why Nibiru became fused so easily with the destroyer idea in modern culture. The old Akkadian term by itself does not demand apocalypse, but once a crossing body, a red marker, a regulator of celestial limits, and a hidden outer world become entangled in modern imagination. Then every ancient catastrophe tradition begins drifting toward it like iron filings toward a magnet. The theory grows by collecting resonance. One text says crossing. Another says red star. Another says destroyer. Another says burning body. Another says returning cycle. Soon the human mind feels not that it has assembled a theory, but that it has rediscovered one. That can be dangerous. Of course, resonance is not proof. But resonance is not nothing either. The source becomes most effective here when it lets that tension remain. It does not need to say that the Kolbrin, the Eye of Ra, wormwood, and Nibiru are definitely the same object. What it can say, and says powerfully, is that civilizations separated by language and time kept preserving the same emotional conclusion. The sky has the power to end an age. It has done so before. It may do so again. And if that is the conclusion, then modern astronomy becomes more frightening by proximity, because Planet 9, a distant cold super-Earth, if it exists, is not itself the destroyer of these stories. Its orbit is too long, its distance too vast, its influence too indirect. But the existence of one hidden body makes the existence of other hidden classes of celestial danger easier to think. Comets, rogue objects, distant perturbers, ancient near passes, disrupted reservoirs of debris. Once the outer system is admitted to be incomplete, the old certainty that nothing important remains unseen begins to fail. I have always thought that is the real psychological threshold in this mystery. Not finding Nibiru itself, but losing the comfort of closure. The old texts thrive in that loss of closure. They do not need to be unanimous. They need only to remain stubborn. A red celestial body, a destroyer, a crossing point, a burning star, a purifier, a poisoner of waters, a reset force. Each tradition gives its own face to the same dread, and dread, when it survives that long, usually survives because it has attached itself to some recurring class of experience. The room feels quieter at this stage of the story, perhaps because the sky has become the active character now. No longer backdrop, no longer decoration. It is the source of warning and memory together. The priests of old Egypt, the scholars of Babylon, the apocalyptic seers of later traditions, they all lived under a world in which celestial disorder could not be safely dismissed as distant. It was intimate. It could reach the rivers, the harvests, the skin, the lungs, the dead. And from here the source takes the final step, from remembered celestial destroyers to a fully imagined modern close pass. Not a myth now, a scenario. What would happen if a massive body came near enough to Earth to disturb it without striking it? What would gravity do? What would the oceans do? What would the crust do? That is where the old stories and the modern simulations begin looking at each other in a way that is much too calm to be comfortable. If a massive body passed near Earth, it would not need to touch us to change everything. That is one of the most unsettling truths in planetary dynamics. And it is the point where the source stops circling old warnings and begins letting them breathe into a modern catastrophe model. Not a direct collision. Not a bright movie ending. Something stranger. A near presence. A gravitational trespass. The kind of event that begins invisibly and only later becomes undeniable through the behavior of everything else. Recently, high-resolution astrophysical simulations run on modern supercomputing systems have explored what happens when large celestial bodies pass through the wrong region of an existing system. The results are never tidy. That is what stays with me. Systems do not fail in a straight line. They start trembling. Orbits distort. Resonances shift. Smaller bodies become dangerous. Atmospheres respond. Magnetic fields become stressed. Tidal systems amplify. Long sleeping geological fault lines begin behaving like nerves touched too hard. Again, this does not prove a specific returning Nibiru. It does something almost more disturbing. It shows how physically plausible cascading planetary trauma really is once enough mass enters the wrong relationship. The source imagines this in escalating layers, and the layers feel believable in exactly the old mythic way. First the moon, not because the moon is weak, but because the moon is close, and closeness means sensitivity. Its orbit begins to drift, perhaps only slightly at first, but enough that the tides stop behaving like obedient old companions. Coastlines learn fear quickly. Harbors begin noticing irregular poles. Fishermen, satellite systems, tidalgauges, and shore cities would all begin telling the same uneasy story. The sea is no longer keeping its old appointments. Picture the first signs of that. Not giant waves on day one. Something subtler and more sinister. A harbor tide too high at the wrong hour. Then too low where it should have risen. Then storms that seem to draw deeper from the ocean than their season should allow. The ordinary person does not yet think. A massive body is approaching. The ordinary person thinks only that the world has become unreliable in a new way. Then the atmosphere begins to answer. Geomagnetic disturbance. Perhaps. The source speaks of magnetic field flicker, satellites failing, cities losing power under stormed skies. This sounds dramatic until you remember how delicately the modern world balances itself on invisible fields and orbital infrastructure. Ancient civilizations feared fire from heaven because heaven could reach the crops and the river. We should perhaps be more frightened because heaven can now also reach navigation. Grids, communication, aviation, weather prediction, medical supply chains, and the thin electric nervous system of global civilization. You know that feeling when a room loses power and instantly becomes older than it was a second before. Multiply that by continents. The source then darkens further into tectonic response. Again, not because a passing object magically punches volcanoes awake with one blow, but because gravitational and tidal stresses, if great enough, could redistribute pressure through already loaded fault systems. Earth is not a dead stone. It is a living engine of crust over fire. Yellowstone appears in the transcript as a symbol of terrifying buried potential, and whether that exact caldera would respond in the imagined way or not, the larger principle holds. A stressed planetary system can wake what had been sleeping. Imagine a dawn where the first ash begins falling not like cinematic thunder, but like fine gray dust settling on parked cars, rooftops, leaves, empty roads. The sun is still there, but muted. The air changes taste. Somewhere far away, a volcanic system has entered the story. Again another. The old texts describing smoke, darkened sky, and altered rivers begin to feel less poetic and more observational than we once assumed. I have always thought volcanic winter is one of the loneliest phrases in science. It sounds clinical, but inside it is starvation, silence, dim light, shortened growing seasons, animal collapse, migration, and the slow psychological grief of a world whose sunlight no longer feels trustworthy. The source understands that instinctively. Catastrophe is not only impact, it is after weather. Then come the storms. A near-pass scenario would not simply shake the ground and leave. It would rewrite gradients, heat distribution, ocean behavior, jet stream structure, pressure patterns. In old myth, this becomes divine wrath, sky fire, unnatural wind, roaring sea. In modern terms, it becomes cyclonic systems of impossible breadth, weather no longer attached to expected season. Rainfall where there should be drought, drought where there should be thaw, winds arriving as if the atmosphere had forgotten its own habits. Ancient records often compress all of this into one terrible sentence. The heavens raged. That sentence may be closer to systems truth than we give it credit for. And then the tsunamis. Liquid mountains is the phrase the source leans toward. And while the phrase is dramatic, there are moments when drama is simply proportion, catching up with reality. Water moved by a planetary insult does not ask whether a coastline is wealthy, sacred, Ahmed, modern, or old. It only follows force. A wall of ocean traveling inland across roads, ports, omens, temples, data centers, airports, farms, burial grounds, all the layered human geography we mistake for permanence. That is exactly the kind of sight civilizations would remember for a very long time, and then encode in religious language because ordinary language would not hold it. If you were standing here with me by the fireplace, I think I would say that this is the moment where myth and science become cousins. Myth says rivers changed and stars fell and the land was overwhelmed. Science says a near pass could cascade through tides, crust, magnetic systems, and debris fields. Neither one gives you the whole thing alone. Together they create a kind of grim plausibility. The source also imagines one final cruelty that I find especially persuasive: the delayed debris storm. Not the main event itself, but what follows if a large object disturbs belts or clouds of smaller bodies at the edge of the system. Even years later, Earth could still be passing through consequences. A sky that has already frightened the world once returns with falling fire. This is exactly the kind of pattern ancient memory would preserve as cyclic visitation. Not one disaster, a season of disasters, clustered around a celestial passage. That cluster matters because it helps explain why old texts often speak as though a destroyer both comes and continues coming. A single day can begin an age of aftermath. Of course, the cautious voice must remain present. We cannot say that modern astronomy has found the destroyer. We cannot say that Nibiru is confirmed. We cannot say that every ancient apocalypse text is a remembered astronomical event and not also theology, metaphor, or literary warning. That would be too easy, and the truth is not easy here. But we can say that the ancient intuition, the sky can change the fate of the earth without striking it directly, is far more physically sensible than modern arrogance often pretends. Honestly, that may be the quietest and darkest truth in the whole source. The ancients may not have been simple. They may have been encoding a systems-level fear that modern civilization is only now beginning to rediscover through simulation. The Egyptians called it the destroyer. Revelation gave the world wormwood. Mesopotamian tradition gave us a crossing body, a celestial regulator, a word that refused to stay small. Sitchin gave the modern imagination a returning world. Astronomers gave us Planet X, then Pluto, then disappointment, then the Kuiper Belt, then Sedna, then Planet 9. And with each step outward, the certainty of closure weakened a little more. The old story did not become true in any simple way. It became harder to bury. And maybe that is enough to disturb the sleep of a civilization that has long assumed the heavens are passive scenery. There is a final image I cannot quite leave alone. A family in some old age standing outside at dusk after weeks of strange signs. The moon too bright one night, too dim the next. The sea acting wrongly. Animals restless. Dust in the air from some far rupture. Then a red body, or a red light, or some terrible atmospheric effect that the memory later calls a red body, because that is the closest shape language can give it. The children stare. The elders begin remembering what they hoped were only stories. Priests return to archive rooms. Scribes search for older tablets. The whole civilization turns backward because the sky has started speaking in an ancient dialect again. That is why these stories survive. They are not only about outer space. They are about the moment when the world stops feeling safely familiar and human beings realize they may have been warned. Now the fire is lower. The room has softened. And perhaps that is the best place to end this part of the journey. Not in proof, not in panic. In that older, quieter feeling. The hidden mass may exist beyond the known system. Ancient texts preserved a crossing body and repeated celestial warning. Catastrophe traditions across cultures keep describing sky-linked endings and beginnings. We are left, then, with something more enduring than a theory. We are left with a pattern, and patterns are what ancient people trusted when memory had to outlive certainty. The next time a civilization looks up and feels too comfortable beneath the stars, it may be worth remembering that the oldest watchers did not always see peace there. Sometimes they saw order. Sometimes they saw boundary. And sometimes, in the red edge of the imagination, they saw return. Recently, researchers fed thousands of lines of ancient catastrophe literature into advanced language models, not to force the texts to agree with each other, but to see whether the same deep pattern would keep returning beneath different gods, different alphabets, different centuries, and different kinds of fear. What came back was not a single neat answer. It was stranger than that. The AI kept surfacing the same sequence, again and again. First, a sign in the sky that does not fit the normal order. Then a period of disbelief, ritual anxiety, or delayed recognition. Then water behaving in ways that no longer feel loyal to the earth. Then fire, ash, sickness, or collapse. Then survivors trying to store what happened in language strong enough to outlast memory loss. And once I saw that pattern laid out so clearly, I honestly felt the room go a little colder. It is one thing to read one old text about a destroyer in the heavens. It is another to watch a modern system compare many traditions at once and quietly conclude that human beings have preserved the same celestial dread for a very long time. Not the same name, not the same theology, not the same cosmology, but the same emotional structure. Something appears above. Order below begins to fail. Human beings realize too late that the sky was never only background. That is where the old Egyptian material begins to breathe differently. The Eye of Ra, in its most severe forms, is not only symbolic anger. It is radiant force, overwhelming force, a divine pressure descending through light and heat. The source transcript places this beside the destroyer traditions for good reason. Ancient peoples often described unbearable natural events through divine imagery because divine imagery was the strongest language they had. If the sky turned red, if the air itself seemed to burn, if fields failed under a dimmed or altered sun, if disease followed atmospheric ruin, then to say that wrath had descended was not primitive confusion. It was compression. It was trauma turning into sacred speech. Imagine standing on the edge of an old river kingdom at dawn after a night, when the sky did not behave as it should. The horizon is not gold. It is a bruised red, almost brown in places, with strange bright veins in it where light should have come cleanly but did not. The river is moving, but the surface is wrong. Too restless in some stretches, too heavy in others. Dust settles on skin even when no ordinary storm has passed. Birds are quieter. Animals turn their heads toward the sky and then away from it. A priest watches the line where earth meets heaven and feels in his chest that some threshold has been crossed. Later, he will say, the eye descended. Later, a scribe will preserve the warning in ritual language. But in the moment itself, before all that language arranges itself, there is only the body recognizing that the world has become less trustworthy. I think we forget how intimate the ancient relationship to the sky really was. Modern people live under ceilings, under electric light, under forecasts, under layers of mediation that make the heavens feel abstract most days. Ancient people did not. The sky was a direct authority. It governed planting, harvest, flood, travel, kingship, omen reading, sacrifice, and fear. If the sky changed, then reality changed with it. That is why celestial warning traditions entered so deeply into memory. They were not eccentric side stories. They were world stories. The Kolbrin material, whatever one thinks of its textual history, belongs in this atmosphere because it preserves exactly that feeling. A great body, a destroyer, smoke, upheaval, the rearrangement of familiar things. Historians are right to be cautious, and caution is healthy here. The manuscript story is contested. The chain of preservation is uncertain. We cannot use it carelessly. Yet even if one sets aside claims of exact antiquity, the imagery itself lands in the same old basin of fear. A red or dark celestial intruder. Fire and flood following close behind. A world not ending cleanly, but convulsing through layers of breakdown. You know that feeling when a story may not be fully reliable in every historical detail, yet still feels like it has wandered into the same haunted forest as older true fears. That is the place this material occupies. Not final proof. Not worthless noise. Resonance. The same is true of wormwood in Revelation. It is apocalyptic literature, highly symbolic, full of layered theological intent. It should not be flattened into a modern astronomy bulletin, but it should not be emptied of physical imagination either. A burning body falls. Waters are made bitter. Human suffering ripples outward. Even there, so far from Babylon and the old cuneiform world, the structure persists. The heavens do not merely decorate the final crisis. They trigger it. they deliver it. They mark the transition from one order to another. This recurring transition is what the AI comparison work kept finding. Not just object language, but threshold language. Crossing, descent, falling, appearing, returning, breaking bounds, disturbing waters, reordering time. It is as though civilizations repeatedly felt that great celestial danger arrived not as a random accident only, but as a passage point. One age crossed into another. One world ended and another began. That, to me, is the deepest connection back to Nibiru as a crossing point. Even if Nibiru was not originally a single rogue planet, its emotional destiny may always have been to become the name for an interruption in cosmic order that human beings could feel but never fully master. If you were sitting here with me by the fireplace, and the room had grown still enough that you could hear your own breathing and the small whisper of the flame, I think I would say that this is where the story stops being about one object and becomes about recurrence. The destroyer returns because human memory keeps meeting the same celestial terror at the edges of different languages. A red body in one tradition, a crossing star in another, a burning descent in another, an eye of wrath in another. The names differ because memory travels through culture. The fear persists because culture keeps finding the same sky waiting above it. This is why modern astronomical uncertainty matters so much. Not because it proves the old myths word for word, but because it deprives us of the comfort of a closed map. Once astronomers admitted that the outer solar system might still contain large unseen bodies. Once Sedna and other distant objects started behaving like clues instead of decorations. Once Planet 9 became a mathematically serious possibility rather than a childish fantasy, the modern world lost one of its easiest dismissals. We could no longer say with complete confidence that nothing significant remained hidden in the dark. That shift alone gave the old stories new oxygen. And old stories are like coals. They do not need much oxygen to begin glowing again. The source transcript also understands that ancient catastrophe memory rarely comes in one clean image. It comes in clusters. Fire in the sky, then ash, then water, then plague, then lost harvest, then kings falling, then temples asking why the gods have turned their faces. In modern systems, science, that kind of cluster feels familiar, not because science proves the mythic source, but because real planetary disruption also cascades. One disturbance becomes 5. One failure unlocks another. A sky event becomes an agricultural event, then a political event, then a disease event, then a migration event, then a civilizational memory event. Ancient people were very good at preserving cluster trauma, even when they could not separate every cause with the tidy categories modern people prefer. That is one reason the old records deserve more respect than they often receive. Not blind belief. Respect. A civilization that tells you the stars moved from their places. Rivers changed course. Smoke filled the land. And death came afterward, may not be giving you modern instrumentation. It may be giving you something almost as valuable. The lived sensory grammar of systems collapse. I have always thought that survivors remember in textures first. The smell of ash in a river city, the strange brightness before darkness, the sound of animals before people understand what is wrong, the taste of water turning bad, the silence after a wind that should not have been possible. Those textures then harden into sacred language, because sacred language is what can carry unbearable textures beyond the lifetime of one witness. That is exactly how a destroyer tradition would endure. Not as perfect astronomy, as embodied warning. The AI models used in the scenario of this story are especially good at detecting this kind of deep repetition because they do not become bored by scale. They can compare thousands of descriptions of celestial disorder and notice that poisoned waters cluster with falling fire more often than chance would suggest. They can detect that red or burning sky images repeatedly appear near language of judgment, reset, or the end of an age. They can flag that crossing language and return language belong unusually often to bodies that are not treated as normal stars. That does not make the machine wise. It makes it useful. The human researcher still has to look at what the machine found and ask whether the recurrence is meaningful, accidental, literary, or historical. But when the recurrence gets this persistent, dismissal becomes lazy. And the persistence here is extraordinary. That is why I think the source is strongest when it stops demanding that every tradition describe one literal, identical object and instead lets the old fear remain multiform. Perhaps a comet in one age, a planetary near-pass memory in another, an atmospheric catastrophe interpreted theologically in another, a crossing title that migrated from a technical, astronomical context into apocalyptic imagination, a hidden outer body in modern astronomy that reopens symbolic space without confirming the old myths outright. These do not cancel one another. They gather. The room grows quieter when you realize that gathering may itself be the real story. Human beings may have been preserving not one simple secret planet, but a recurring encounter with celestial instability, one terrible enough that every age felt obliged to rename it. And once renamed, it returned again inside literature, religion, fringe theory, and scientific suspicion. The destroyer remains because the structure remains useful. It explains why the sky can feel like law one century and threat the next. It explains why ancient people watched so carefully. It explains why modern people, even after mockery and dismissal and bad translations and sensational books, still feel a small involuntary chill when they hear the word Nibiru spoken slowly in the dark. Soon this long chain of fear must narrow into one final reflection, not on what any one tablet proves, not on whether one modern outsider solved the whole thing, but on what survives when all the names are stripped back and only the pattern remains. A hidden approach, a disturbed earth, a civilization caught between denial and remembrance. That final stillness is where the story is heading now, toward the oldest and simplest warning of all. Watch the sky. It does not always come empty. At the end of a mystery like this, the most dangerous thing is certainty. Too much certainty from believers, and the story becomes cheap spectacle. Too much certainty from skeptics, and the story becomes thinner than the evidence of human memory deserves. The wiser mood is quieter. The wiser mood lays the fragments out gently and looks at the shape they make when the room has gone still. That is where I think the Nibiru story becomes most haunting. Not when it is shouted, but when it is arranged. We began with a rumor of return, a hidden body somewhere beyond the familiar planets. A force not yet seen clearly, perhaps not even correctly named, but heavy enough in the imagination to have survived for decades. Perhaps much longer, if its roots do in fact reach back through Babylonian astronomy into older celestial fear. Then we looked at the Akkadian word itself. Nibiru. A crossing. A passing over. A celestial threshold. Already that was enough to disturb the easy modern version, because the oldest meaning was not simple. And old things that resist simplicity often endure. Then came Babylon and Marduk. The world after chaos. Stations fixed in the heavens. Boundaries ordained. Nibiru tied not only to motion, but to rule, order, and the determination of limits. That was a crucial turn, because once a crossing point becomes part of the architecture of cosmic authority, later ages can no longer think of it as a trivial star name. It acquires symbolic gravity. Then later, readers, especially modern ones, begin asking whether the marker was also an object, whether the object was also a world, whether the world was hidden, whether the hidden thing might return. From there, the story moved into Zecharia Sitchin, who saw ancient fragments and built a total universe from them. He may have overreached badly. Mainstream scholarship has strong reasons for rejecting much of his work. Yet he did something undeniably powerful. He reopened the psychological frontier between ancient text and modern sky. He made the word Nibiru feel alive again, not as a technical note in a star catalog, but as a missing world with an orbit, a cycle, and a role in human origins. Wrong in details, perhaps profoundly wrong, and still influential because he sensed the emotional electricity hidden in the old material. Then modern astronomy complicated everything by refusing to complete the map. Neptune found by disturbance. Pluto found and found too small. The Kuiper Belt discovered. Then the Kuiper Cliff. Sedna moving on its lonely, impossible-seeming path. The mathematical shadow of Planet 9. Unseen Mas. Incomplete architecture. Cold worlds beyond habit. None of this gives us the cinematic Nibiru of popular fear. Yet it does something perhaps more important. It reintroduces humility. The outer dark is still not fully known. Once that is admitted, the old stories stop sounding so easy to dismiss. After that came the destroyer traditions. Egypt. Wormwood. Red celestial memory. Fire and poisoned waters. Sky disruption braided with social collapse. This is where the story widened beyond any one culture and began to look like a cross-civilizational archive of celestial dread. Not identical words. Identical structure often enough to matter. A sign above. Disorder below. Survivors who try to leave behind something stronger than ordinary history. The AI discovery angle in this version of the story only sharpens that. Modern models can compare vast corpora and expose how frequently those patterns recur. They do not tell us exactly what ancient people saw. They tell us that ancient people kept trying to remember the same class of terror. I have always thought that memory may be the real center of this mystery, not the planet. Memory. A civilization does not preserve the same fear over and over unless the fear solved some explanatory problem too important to lose. Why did the world change so violently? Why did water become poison? Why did kings fall at the same time the sky became strange? Why did fire seem to descend before harvest failed? Why did one age end and another begin with celestial dread attached to it? The answers varied, but the need to ask remained. And now we reach the final possibility, the one I think the source is quietly moving toward even when it flirts with stronger claims. Perhaps Nibiru was never only one thing. Perhaps that is why it survived so well. A crossing point in one text, Jupiter in another, a station of Marduk in another, a hidden world in the imagination of one modern writer, a symbolic placeholder for catastrophic celestial return in the imagination of thousands of later readers. A word with enough elasticity to gather every age of sky fear into itself. That would explain a great deal. It would explain why scholars can prove some popular claims wrong and still not dissolve the fascination. It would explain why new astronomical anomalies immediately get pulled into older apocalyptic language. It would explain why the outer solar system feels less like empty distance and more like a waiting room in the human imagination. A word like Nibiru is not only a label, it is a vessel. It carries whatever an age most fears might still be moving beyond its sight. You know that feeling when a story is not literally true in every part, and yet still feels truer than many facts because it has attached itself to a real human vulnerability. That is Nibiru. We live on a small world under forces we did not design. Our sciences are powerful, yet incomplete. Our myths are distorted, yet persist. Our memory is broken, yet stubborn. A crossing body, a hidden force, a celestial return. These ideas endure because they express the same deep confession in different forms. We are not insulated from the sky. If you were sitting here with me in the nearly dark room now, I think I would say that ancient people may have been wiser than modern people in one specific way. They did not assume the heavens were passive. They watched. They feared. They measured. They told stories strong enough to carry danger forward even when the original details blurred. We, on the other hand, became technologically brilliant and emotionally casual about the larger environment above us. We trusted our models, then discovered new anomalies. We declared the map complete, then found more edges. We dismissed old warnings, then built simulations that made those warnings feel physically plausible again in broad form. Not the exact old stories, the broad form, a large hidden mass, a close pass, disturbed tides, atmospheric ruin, cascading systems collapse, survivors preserving memory as sacred narrative. That broad form now lives at the uncomfortable border between mythic memory and legitimate planetary vulnerability. And perhaps that border is the real home of Nibiru. There is one image that stays with me more than any other. A museum drawer opening in a quiet room. Not dramatic at all. Just a drawer. Inside, a clay tablet rests in its modern cradle, fragile, dull brown, unimpressed by us. On it, One old sign for crossing. One old sign for star. One old sign for rule. Nearby, on another continent, astronomers stare at trans-Neptunian datasets and notice clustering that should not quite be there. In another room, scholars compare ancient catastrophe literature and find the same structure again. In another room, a reader who never trusted official closure too much is still thinking about a hidden world at the edge of the system. None of these rooms alone solves the mystery. Together, they keep it alive. And maybe that is enough. Not a final revelation. Not a confirmed apocalypse. Just the recognition that some stories outlive ridicule because they continue to touch a nerve that facts alone never quite numb. The Nibiru nerve is simple. The sky may be less settled than we pretend. History may have forgotten more celestial terror than it admits. And the old world may have left us not a map, but a warning. So let the warning remain what it has always been. Quiet. Repeated. Difficult to classify. Hard to kill. A crossing point in the heavens. A body or marker tied to boundary. A destroyer under other names. A hidden mass at the edge of knowledge. A story that keeps returning because human beings still have not found a better way to say this one ancient truth. Civilization feels permanent right up until the moment a larger order reminds it that it is not. The fire is almost down to coals now. The room is soft around the edges. Somewhere beyond the last familiar orbit, the dark remains what it always was. Not empty, only patient. The ancients looked there and named a crossing. We look there and run calculations. Both acts are forms of listening. And perhaps the deepest mystery is not whether Nibiru is real in one narrow sense, but whether the old world was trying to teach us something more durable than proof. Watch the edges. Respect the sky. Remember that endings have patterns. Good night.